Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Mighty Ducks Game Changers Episode 9. So, reasonably, a lot of people could make the consensus that really, I guess that this show might actually be ending soon with this season. More than likely, I'm assessing that it is probably to end within, I'm assuming, the next episode. Like, I'm assuming that this is going to be just 10 episodes and then we'll be done with this season. I would assess or assume. Because it seems like this episode was to be on for what purpose? Really, I guess there are some things that could have been cemented that haven't been before, but I think really they did not want to do a lot of stuff with this episode. They kind of just phoned this episode in, really very much so. We end up having it to where a bulk of this episode is to basically tie onto very few storylines, to very few things that are going on with this episode. We end up having it to where a bulk of this episode is whether or not Alex is going to be fired or not, the relationship between Evan and Sophie, and also if Bombay is actually going to be coaching the Don't Bothers or not. Because maybe Alex may or may not be quitting being the head coach. Maybe she'll just demand that she wants to be the head coach regardless. Going into this show, immediately I'm just like, man, did they just milk this episode out? They milked it for all it's worth. Basically, this entire episode is basically like stuck with them not even getting to one single game in this episode. We end up having a bulk of the time that this episode is otherwise tied with these people being on the bus for a bulk of this episode, making their way to get to their match, their state thing. We end up having a lot of times where we end up having to tie on to the fact that this show is still done in Minnesota only by shirt form. We have to basically have like a Minnesota State's hockey shirt thing going on in this episode, and I'm immediately just like, I love the fact that they desperately try just by shirt form to remind people that this show is done in Minnesota. You have Minnesota Wild jerseys, you have Gopher shirts, and now you have a Minnesota State thing that you came up with. Good for you. Good for you that you try to do these things just off of shirt form, which I find hilarious. Because there still is not an inkling of honest to true goodness to say that these were actually Minnesota people. To me, it doesn't feel like Minnesota people at all, and I'm from actually Minnesota, so I would know good and well. But anyways, but what am I talking about? Maybe I don't know enough of Minnesota people, but it is what it is. So, going on into here, there is no story for this episode. There's not much to even talk about. And so really, this spoiler version, or just talking about this episode in general, is going to be severely hard, just because there's not much going on. There's not much going on in this one. Man, did they, again, like I said, they phoned this one in. They milked this out. They out of their tookuses out of this episode because it's basically garbage. Really, anything that tends to fall apart in the very early part of this episode comes back together anyways. So it makes for almost a pointless episode, or it doesn't seem to be 100% guaranteed that we have cemented something, even though it might feel like we have. Like, that doesn't 100% mean anything. That doesn't 100% stamp something and say, like, yeah, like we had a huge like shift here. Uh, but yeah, so let's go into this episode. Let's break it down so that way we can call it a day for the Mighty Ducks Game Changers. Because really, it is never going to be a good show. It's never going to be a good show. By the time it ends up being actually a good show, was one episode out of probably what, 10, 12, whichever. And then they'll probably renew it for a second season, and we'll just have to just tolerate it because it's the only thing that's on Disney Plus that isn't a rerun of something. Isn't us just waiting for another Marvel show to come along so that we can watch the heck out of that, or another Star Wars Mandalorian season, or something that is new content within Disney Plus? Come on, Disney Plus, bust out that new content. We need it like uh, a uh, a starving person needs a truck full of cake. So going into this, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this episode. So we end up having it to where we are to eventually immediately have right away to where Evan is going to confront his mother. And so we end up having it to where Nick is calling Evan to let him know, yeah, you need to let your mom go. You know what I'm saying? Like, you need to fire her because I don't want this uncomfortable awkwardness that we're going to have with Alex still being there. And we all want to let her know that she is out of here. She is being ousted as the coach. He's being out. So we end up having Evan, who ends up going to his mother and saying, you know what, Mom? Here's your pink slip. No. We end up having Evan, who basically just confronts Alex, and he's like, yeah, like this hockey thing really isn't fun anymore, and I think we're going to have to let you go. Like, here's a phone number for you to be able to call someone else to be their brother or their son or whatever, and that's just all you. That's all on you. So, yeah, just... And so Alex just says, well, okay, like, sure, fine. Like we end up having it to where Alex doesn't really mow over this. And it's just like, what did I do wrong? Like, no, I think maybe Alex was plotting this all along. That has to be the thing, where Alex was, like, plotting to be, like, the worst coach ever and being just like Coach T to try to drive them to have her quit this job. That seems obvious. That seems obvious now. She was plotting against these kids all along. That's what she was doing. That's why she took this firing so easily. Because I guess she was like, well, you guys have Bombay and you technically like him a lot more. He's your favorite, so you know what? I'm bouncing. I'm deucing. So we end up having it to where it seems that Alex is to find her boss, who is seemingly going through a bad breakup. So it seems that Alex is going to have to cling on to, I believe, Stephanie, which is her boss. And it seems like both Alex and Stephanie are going to have their girl time where they're kind of messing around at work. Plus, it also seems that Alex is getting overtime and all kinds of things just by them just playing around and not really doing their actual job, which is bizarre. But anyways, so we go on to have all the team go into the bus, and it seems like the girls are separated from the guys because, heaven forbid, you make sense of that, really, the separation between the two genders, because I guess we end up having it to where Maya and Sophie and Lauren are all talking about their girls' nights and how they're gonna like spray makeup on one another, and I think they're spraying way too much makeup on one another. It looks ridiculous. And so we end up having it to where reasonably the guys are thinking about having some kind of party, some kind of soiree, and Bombay is kind of like getting everybody jazzed about them, like, hey guys, we made it, like we did it, like we're here, and like we're gonna make it, like it's gonna happen, like believe me. So sure, okay, whatever. So we head on, and so we're on this bus ride, and so we end up having Evan, considering they're having a party of sorts. We end up having Evan saying like, "Well, maybe I should finally like cement like me and like Sophie being a thing. Maybe I should try to text her and let her know that like me and her are gonna go like go together and go to this like party together." And so we end up having it to where it seems that Evan confirms that via text, which of course, like for how we kind of do things now in 2021 or whatever, really like a text is just an easy like yeah, you don't have to like physically be with the. I don't know how many times that I would probably just send a text because it's just easy, and plus two like unless the person is like a foot away, where it's like, hey, you want to. Yeah, that's my big move. That's my go to. Yeah, yeah, one of those. So we have it to where Evan goes and cements his relationship with Sophie, and Sophie is looking at all her gals, and basically it seems like her gals want to be like together forever for everything. And so we end up having Sophie, who is basically send emojis that she's going with the girls, but she'll technically see Evan at this party. So we end up having the boys trying to figure out what the heck the emojis mean because, heaven forbid, they know what the three princes mean, which basically means that three of them are seemingly together here. So we end up going along, and so eventually, once we are to go on and have these people get dropped off at this hotel place, whatever, we eventually have it to where all the people all go where they go, but we end up eventually having it to where it seems that Coach T and Bombay are starting to have a talk with one another. It seems like they're getting to know one another. It seems that Coach T is having a lot of the team's parents kind of harassing him and whatever. So we eventually have it to where Coach T just starts like telling every single story about every single kid that has ever every single kid's parents who has ever like harassed him or hurt him or whatever. And so we end up having Bombay, who ends up telling Coach T about him uh, being banned from ever coaching hockey anymore because he ended up giving a poor kid some money. And we end up having Coach T is like, hey man, if I was in your shoes, I would have done the exact same thing. And so we end up having this like nice moment where you're thinking that Bombay and Coach T, maybe because they're actually Duck coaches and previous ones and in present one, like you would think like, oh, okay, maybe it's just like maybe Coach T is not 100% douchebag, 100% an a-hole, but you would find out differently. You would. You really would. So we end up having it to where Evan is to try to figure out if really Sophie and him are really going to go to this dance together, that they're really going to uh, be boyfriend and girlfriend. And we have like Evan who has this real anxiety, this real hesitation. And so we end up having it to where Evan eventually is to try and confide to one other female who is Mary Jo, who seems to be the person that does some announcing uh, for the Mighty Ducks. Don't bother whoever's whichever. So we end up going along, and so we end up having Evan who is to talk to Mary Jo about like, well, hey, like if I do like a girl and like I think that she might like me, like should I ask her out to go, like what should I do? Like, should I ask this girl out kind of thing? And we have Mary Jo that's like kind of assuming that Evan is actually talking about her, to where Mary Jo is like, well, yeah, like, I would love to go with you. And, like, yeah, I think it'll be fun. And we end up having Evan going, like, yeah, but you weren't actually the woman that I was talking about. So, we end up having, of course, Evan is to kind of walk away from this conversation, and Nick comes to Evan is like, dude, you just asked Mary Jo out for this dance or this party or this whatever. And Evan's like, hey man, like, she mistook what I said. Like, I said a girl, not that girl. And so we end up having to our Nick is like, dude, but I wanted a slice of that pie. I liked that Mary Jo girl. Big fan I was. And so we end up having Evan just kind of in this real conundrum of just like he doesn't know what the heck he's doing at this point. So we end up having, like, you would have thought that Evan would have just called it and just said, like, you know what, I'm just sick. Like, I'm gonna stay and just sleep it off, and like the next day, like the chips will just fall where they may. But I'm not gonna deal with this crap. Like, dude, I just wanted to get some of that. I just wanted to get finally some of that Sophie. But you know what? Then like things went crazy. Things went some kind of crazy ways. So moving on. So we end up having everybody going at this party. So we immediately have it to where Maya is to go with the girls and basically be like, yeah, girls forever. And then immediately we end up having Maya, who grabs the first guy that she ends up seeing and is like, bye, ladies. I'm going to go with this guy. He's cute. And then Laura and then Sophie are just like, wait a minute, what? Like, dude, she just left with some guy that she barely knew, and she's like making out with him and creating a whole entire relationship out of a person that she's had for 2 hours worth of relationship. Because it seems like Maya was like, she was going with this guy and everything was going lovely. It seems like Maya was talking about marriage, and then eventually they have some fight, and then eventually this boy ends up winning her over with some stuffed dog thing. And so Maya is like, oh my god, I forgive you. And it's like, dude, you're going through your whole metamorphosis of a relationship in like what, like a span of 3 hours? Good God, woman. Pump the brakes a little bit. Pump the brakes, lady. So, and I'm sure they're probably gonna eventually keep referencing this with eventually Maya probably getting dumped or something. It's probably gonna happen along somewhere, because they gotta keep like having somebody with a story of something. So they're probably gonna like Instagram or Snapchat one another and whatever, or Zoom call or whichever it is, and they're gonna keep that relationship bizarrely alive, because I don't understand why, but they probably will. So going into this, so we end up having, seemingly since Evan has Mary Jo at his side, we end up having Sophie, who ends up deciding to go with Trevor, who is one of the ducks. And so we eventually have it to where it seems that Evan is just like, you know what? Like, I'm kind of upset that Sophie is with Trevor, but whatever. Trevor's a great guy, whatever. So we eventually end up having it to where Evan is just kind of done with the whole, like, him trying to dance and him trying to be with Mary Jo. Not that Mary Jo isn't a great gal. It's just the fact that Evan just didn't really, like, Evan, like, thought something was going to be simple, and it got complicated as F. So we end up having it to where, like, Ethan just takes Mary Jo and connects her hand with Nick's and just says, dude, like, be a couple. Like, both of you like one another. Both of you want to see one another squirm. And, like, it's obvious that you two are a couple now. So be that. Be that as it may. I've ushered you couple upon couple. So we end up having Evan, who is to pull Sophie away to eventually have them do a photo booth thing where we end up having both Evan and Sophie talking this out about how like Sophie was angry that Evan was with Mary Jo, and Evan was angry that Sophie was with Trevor. Ba 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 ba. All this garbage, to where reasonably we have to kind of relay that Evan didn't know that Sophie wanted to go with him to this party, that eventually they were going to be a couple, whichever. Just a bunch of garbage goop that doesn't matter. So we eventually have it to where reasonably Sophie and Evan are angry at one another, to where eventually Sophie storms off and Evan is just like, I'm so sad this relationship probably isn't going to work. So we eventually go along, and so we end up having seemingly so we have we end up eventually having it to where it seems that Bombay is in some hot water. It seems that this character is to not be eligible to be the head coach of this team. I'm like, dude, like, so wait a minute, like, they didn't check his credentials any time before, like, and I guess probably Alex was probably the head coach at the time, and so maybe they didn't check her credentials either. Like, you would have thought that somebody who was being anyone's coach would have had some kind of hockey credentials of some kind, but I guess anybody in the brother could have just coached this team and it would have been fine. So we end up going along, and so we end up having Alex, who's going on to be called by Evan because it seems that Bombay is in hot water and that he won't be able to coach this team. So we end up having Alex, who is forced to scramble to make her way to where they are at to try and legally and lawyerly try to be able to figure out the whole leeway of Bombay eventually either coaching this team or being a part of this team or whatever. So we end up going along. So we had it to where Bombay is talking to these Pee-wee hockey team people to eventually yay or nay Bombay being to be a coach on this team. And so we end up having it to where Alex swoops in to eventually tell them, well, hey, like, there was never a actual person that showed up at any number of any of our hockey games that came from you people to ask for Bombay's qualifications or record or whatever. And so, really, since you guys did not actually come to any of our hockey games to ask for this coach's papers or whatever, or this and that, like, then you don't have the rights to be able to not have Bombay be a person that cannot coach this team, and we end up having the guys of the judges of whatever Bombay yay or nay or whatever or not. They end up going like, well, yeah, woman, you're right. Well, I guess Bombay, how about you just be the coach of this team? Because we just needed something to just eat time for this episode. And Bombay's like, well, yeah, that's great. Because now I'm the coach of this team, I guess. Because really, we end up having it to where Alex is technically going to be there and is technically going to be with the team to go off and make it to states anyways, with her technically being either a coach or the coach. Either way, she's going along with them to probably be their coach. So here's the thing. So we ended up having, at the very beginning of this episode, we ended up firing Alex for no reason. We ended up having to have Alex spend time with her boss for no reason. We end up having also Evan, who is to eventually try to get with Sophie, but then she's like, I don't really care. Like, we'll figure something out later. And then a lot of that, no reason. And then eventually we end up having Maya, who's telling the rest of her girls that it's girl power forever. Then she leaves with a guy. And so, again, all this girl thing, no reason. And so we end up having Evan, who is to get back on this bus and to tell Sophie that she needs to meet him in the middle of the bus to talk about themselves, to talk about them being a thing or not. So we have Sophie who ends up meeting Evan in the middle of the bus. I'm like, dude, you could have done this off to the side of the road. You could have done this before you got on the bus. You could have this kind of seems like really personal to be like in the middle of the bus. Come on, like they could have really I don't know. They could have done something else. But we end up having, after this conversation is over, we end up having seemingly Evan expressing and Sophie expressing that it seems that they really do actually like one another. What does that mean in English? Don't know. That doesn't cement we should have had either Evan or Sophie cement boyfriend girlfriend parameters, not just, oh, well, I like you, well, I like you too. That doesn't mean anything. That doesn't say 100% that they are boyfriend girlfriend now. That just cements that it's like, well, I guess we have feelings for one another, but that is so vague and so not exactly they should have kissed, or they should have held hands, or they should have done something like hugging or something that cemented this relationship much better at the tail end of this episode than just saying that they liked one another, because that means nothing. That means absolutely nothing. And a lot of people could have a debate about that and a difference of opinion, but to me, that didn't cement anything between these two people. I think they really wanted to try to make this mysterious, to just be like, well, here's the thing. So we could have ended up, that's all, folks. So here's the thing. We could have had it to where, so Evan and Sophie, they argued. And so that means that they hated one another. So, we went from 0 to -1 between these two people. And so when Evan and really Sophie get on the bus and talk about their feelings between one another, when 0 was the very beginning of this episode, and then -1 was them being argumentative between one another, and we end up having to where that bus conversation puts us right back to 0. It does not bring us to, oh, hey, they're gonna date after this. They're gonna be in this thing called the love. They're it cements nothing. I don't feel like the conversation that they had cemented anything. Besides maybe and plus also when Evan tells Sophie that they're going to meet in the middle of the bus, you should have immediately realized that Evan should have just came out and just said well, I guess considering that you wanted to sit next to me, you wanted to talk this out, which just means that actually you still have feelings for me, I have feelings for you. Let's cement this right now that really we're going to be a couple, an item, or whatever. Let's pen to paper this right now to just seal the deal on this whole thing. Because reasonably, even though we argue, because mistakes were made and whatever, we can cement now that this is gonna go places. That we're gonna sell this to people. It's gonna go. We're gonna be out in the town at some point in this show, being a couple, because that does that just resets that hey, but they're still really good friends. No, I don't like that garbage. That doesn't cement anything. So it's nothing gets accomplished in this episode. And we're back to square one with Alex basically still being the head coach. Bombay is still like backseat coaching. And we really have it to where a lot of this episode was a lot of nothing. So that's all that I have to say about this review. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.